All right, now the last part of this chapter that I want to go into is personal risk factors. This is exercise 1.2 on page 21. Personal risk factors are really important to understand. What it says is below you'll find a list of biological, environmental, and other conditions that increase the risk for addiction. So again, not just your first use of drugs and alcohol, not necessarily just using drugs and alcohol daily. We do see those people that use drugs and alcohol on a daily basis, and then something happens and they just sort of phase out of it, or they stop and they move on. They get into a relationship, they find a job or something, and then they just kind of like just give it up really easily. So these are risk factors for people who go from regular use to addiction and that loss of control. So what are the risk factors that people have that put them at risk from going from regular drug use to actual addiction? The first point they say is having at least one family member who suffers from addiction. The second is having depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, other psychological problems. The third point they say is your parent or other role models used alcohol or drugs excessively around you when you were growing up. So having role models that you grew up with or that were around you that used drugs and alcohol. These are important. Why? So when we're in early recovery, it's important to look at the here and now of what I'm struggling with to stay drug and alcohol free, like cravings, being around the wrong group of people, environmental triggers, really heavy emotions like anger, resentment, so on and so forth. Yeah, you want to work on those things in the here and now and work through those. But then at some point, it's really helpful to understand these risk factors of what led to the drug use in the first place, because those are important to address at the right time and place. Those are important to address at the right time and place to complete the healing process and to transition to long-term success and recovery. The other important thing about risk factors, and this takes some time to really grasp and understand, and a lot of working with other people too, is it provides us a sense of compassion for ourselves. It helps us see that we weren't necessarily bad people or just broken or like crazy or there's something wrong with us. It helps us to really see what risk factors lead to people developing addiction. It helps us to see that at a vulnerable point in our time, in our life, perhaps, we just had the cards stacked against us. And oftentimes it's easier for us to see it in other people and have compassion in other people. And that's where helping the newcomer or helping other people becomes really valuable. That's one of the rewards of doing that work. Okay, the next bullet point on page 22 says your parents or other role models engaged in criminal behavior consistently when growing up. So it kind of like lowers the threshold of drugs and alcohol or the things we need to do to maintain those habits. It lowers the threshold of what's acceptable and not. Next point is you had friends and acquaintances at school who were using drugs and alcohol when you were in your teens. Next, you had trouble in school as a child. Next, you had difficulty making or keeping friends or feeling like you fit in with your peers when you were growing up. There was a lot of chaos and conflict at home when you were growing up, fighting between adults in your home, physical or sexual abuse, starting to experiment with alcohol or drugs as a child or in your early teen years, smoking or injecting drugs. And this is because when you smoke or inject, it has a much higher reinforcement than when you snort or when you take medications from the oral route. So if you can avoid smoking or injecting, avoid it. It takes it to a whole nother ballgame. You had some traumatic experiences in your life prior to starting to use alcohol or drugs excessively. And then it goes on to say the more risk factors you have, the more vulnerable you are. So if you have a lot of checks marked above, it will help you to make sense of why you've been affected by addiction. But even if you didn't check any of these off, you can still be affected by addiction. And this, by the way, doesn't encompass the whole list of risk factors. So there's also genetic risk factors that aren't discussed here and other risk factors as well. And then also, what does it mean, physical abuse? What does it mean, sexual abuse? And there's other factors that are not mentioned here. So keep exploring that and researching that and keeping an eye open for that. So those risk factors help us, number one, to help us feel compassion for ourselves and kind of get an understanding of why this has happened. Because look, beating yourself up does not put you in a good emotional state to go into battle. If you had to get in a fight, would you rather go into that fight angry or empowered and feeling like you have the tools to win? Or would you rather go into the fight like, I'm a terrible person, I deserve to be beaten up anyway, something's wrong with me, I don't even care? So you want to make sure that you have a mindset that works for you. More important than the mindset that you just arbitrarily choose is cultivating a mindset that works for you. A warrior mindset, because we're certainly in battle. We shouldn't make a mistake about that. So page 23 is wrap up. And this is the last section, the wrap up. In this chapter, you've learned some important things about yourself. You explored some of the unique aspects of your history, family, life experiences that placed you at risk for addiction. You also identified your symptoms of addiction. You can reflect on this list anytime you need to strengthen or remind yourself of your motivation to keep on actively working on your recovery. By understanding addiction and understanding our particular addiction, we're able to better attack it. In the next chapter, you will deepen your understanding of the way addiction has affected you and how some of the effects of these substances on the brain can explain your loss of control over alcohol and drugs. The next chapter is chapter 2, addiction as a brain disease, and we'll go into that. And then after that chapter, it starts talking about overcoming addictive behaviors, and that's the rest of the book.